Hello. I'm Ian, and it's mostly new faces in here. So just quickly who I am. I'm an accessibility specialist. My background before that was design and UX. Started getting into accessibility when working on kids games for the BBC, little Teletubbies and all that kind of stuff. And now that's all I do. So today I've got a couple of things for you. I'm going to start off with a little bit about why accessibility games is important and some of the ways in which it differs from other industries. I'm only going to cover those two things briefly because the main thing I want to talk to you about is some of the interesting things that have been happening in the field over the past year, because it's quite an eventful time at the moment. So first off, why games? You still hear this question asked quite a bit in the wider accessibility community. You know, why are we bothering with stuff like this when there's so many other more important, bigger issues to solve? And there's two main answers to that question. The first one being this: it's a $100 billion industry, which is like a big fancy number, but so for context, movies 38 billion, music 43 billion. So gaming is a huge, huge industry. Actually, to reach this 100 billion figure, you need to combine all other screen entertainment. So like DVDs, cinema, box office, all that kind of stuff. Combine them all together, you start to get to the same kind of figure as the games industry. So with that kind of, those kind of figures rolling around, there's a lot of money to be made through accessibility and a lot of money to be lost through inaccessibility. So an example, I assume most of the people in the room, at least they're familiar with this game, is of course Candy Crush. And what you are looking at the moment is a textbook example of how to design for colour blindness. So you can see that everything here that's differentiated by colour is also differentiated either by shape or by pattern as well. Until they introduce the bombs. So you can see here the bombs are exactly the same design, just separated by colour. So I'd like you just to keep an eye on these three bombs at the bottom: the green, the orange and the red. And that's what it looks like with a common form of colour blindness. So you can see at this point, like that's it, that's the end of your experience. You can't play beyond this point. And actually the point at which they introduce the bombs is pretty close to the point that they start monetizing the game. And the way that the monetization works in Candy Crush, in keeping with lots of other mobile games and increasingly console games as well, is that it's a free-to-play game that is reliant on microtransactions. And microtransactions are based on retention. So basically they rely on, like most of the people who play Candy Crush just never spend any money, they keep playing for free. They rely on a small bunch of people who have clearly enough money to do so and just keep on playing for a long time, spending more and more money. So they just have a few high-value customers. And if one of those potential high-value customers is colourblind, then that's it, they're gone. And to put that in context, when this was going on, Candy Crush was pulling in a couple of $100 million per quarter. So that's just a staggering amount of money that's potentially gone down the drain just because of such a tiny little design decision. So that's the first answer. The second answer is slightly less mercenary. It's the human benefit of accessibility. So to explain this, I'm going to give you an example. It's a story from back when I was working on those kids games. And I don't know if anyone here is big CBeebies watchers. Mr. Tumble fan, something special? Okay, good. So this is Something Special is a CBeebies show that's aimed primarily at language development in low-functioning autistic kids. And we were working on games to support and enhance the TV show. They had to be built around the same kind of standards. So in particular, this bit of the project was looking at, that we're looking at that time was around accessibility switches. So that's tech that's, if you're not familiar, is used by people who can't operate traditional input devices. So it's basically anything that operates with a simple on-off signal. So that could be a tube you blow into, a big button on your wheelchair headrest, any of that kind of stuff. So we got to the point where we were doing our user research and we were going into kids' homes and observing how they got on with their own custom hardware at home. We made a bit of a rookie error. When we were doing the recruitment, we said that we were looking for people who have this kind of technology. What we should have asked for is people who use this kind of technology, because we actually ended up in one kid's homes who, they had this setup very similar to this, but they couldn't actually use it at all. They had quite profound learning disabilities, so they're completely non-verbal, and they also had severe motor impairment. And through the combination of those two things, not only was it really, really difficult and painful just to try and press a single button, but their parents also couldn't communicate with them about what the point was, why they should have to go through that in the first place. Now, the reason their parents had got them this kit was in the hope that if someday they would be able to operate just that single button, they'd be able to use something like this, which is a communications grid. So this is like a kidified version of the tech that Stephen Hawking used to use to communicate. So basically you have this grid of words, you have one of them highlighted. Every few seconds, that highlight moves between the words. So no matter what kind of tiny interaction you can manage, you make that interaction, it selects a word, you build up a sentence, it then speaks it out through synthesized speech. So they got this device in the hope that someday they might be able to actually have a conversation with their child. But they couldn't, like I said, they couldn't get it through what the point was, and it was too difficult. So it was obvious that our time there wasn't going to be hugely useful. There was no way that they could test this game. But the parents knew that the kid liked Mr. Tumble, that the kid liked the TV show. So they said, as you've come all the way out to our house anyway, it may as well just show it to our kid. They might get something from the experience even if they can't play it. So I'll just get that out of the way a second. So basically what happened was the button was on the table, and the dad put the child in his lap and put the child's hand on top of the button and just played the game for them. That went on for a little while, and then he said, "Look at that." And the child was just starting to stretch out their fingers in an attempt to press the button. And they'd never done anything like that before. So obviously, as a result of that, the lives of that child and of that children were going to be completely different. And the reason why that had worked when nothing else had was specifically because it was a game. Because of that engagement. There wasn't any reason anymore to have to try and to explain anything to the child. The child just really wanted to play with Mr. Tumble on the screen. So it's no exaggeration at all to say that games can completely and profoundly change people's lives. And it doesn't have to be that kind of niche stuff either, because what games really represent is access to recreation, to culture, to socializing, which is stuff that a lot of people take for granted. But if for any reason your access to those things is restricted in day-to-day life, games can then become a really, really important contributor to people's quality of life. So that's a bit on the why. Next, how it's different. The obvious way that accessibility differs in games to other industries is the input. So a typical game controller here. So you can see here it has 4, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 buttons on there. It also has these 2 analog joysticks that you need to use simultaneously. You can also click them in, which is an extra 2 buttons on top. This thing here is a touchscreen as well, also to use simultaneously. So you can see pretty clearly that the kind of motor demands of an input device like this are way, way beyond using like a mouse or a keyboard or something like that. You also have much greater demands on all the other areas of accessibility. So much greater reliance on being able to spot tiny low contrast bits of interface objects. Much greater cognitive demands, having to navigate complex environments and juggle lots of simultaneous objectives. Hearing as well. So you've got all these kind of extra demands on these different areas of accessibility. And to complicate things further, games have to be inaccessible. It's part of the definition of what a game is. If you were to remove all the accessibility barriers from a game, that would remove all the challenge from it. And it wouldn't be a game anymore. It would just be a narrative or a toy. So, taking all those things into account, it can kind of seem a bit like this. It's a bit overwhelming, the kind of approach that's involved compared to other industries. But it's actually fairly straightforward. That issue that I was talking about with... I lost my train of thought now. Give me a second. Can't remember, I'll skip ahead. So basically there's two overriding principles that basically can solve pretty much any issue of accessibility in gaming. The first one, communicate information in more than one way. So this is the kind of thing that is the most commonly seen in other industries. So this covers things like subtitles, like text as well as audio, using an icon or a shape as well as a color, like in Candy Crush. The other one allows some flexibility in how the game is played. So this differs a little bit. So this is all about personalization and customization, offering some kind of options for difficulty, options for speed, all that kind of stuff. And there's much, much more chance that people are actually going to do this in games as well, compared to, for example, a website or an app, because a game is something that people will invest a lot of time in. So that work of going through the settings and tailor things to your needs is much more easy to justify in a product that you're spending that kind of much time with. There's a ton of specific considerations. I'm not going to go into them because I haven't got time, but if you want to know what kind of accessibility guidelines apply to games, go to Game Accessibility Guidelines. So this is just gameaccessibilityguidelines.com. There's tons of examples of barriers and solutions on there. So next, recent advancements. So this is the real bulk of what I wanted to talk about, because in the time that I've been working in the field, it has changed astronomically beyond all recognition. Now, how things were 10 years ago is nothing like that. Even how things were 2 years ago is really unrecognizable. So the last year has been no different at all. There's been way too much stuff for me to be able to cover in the next kind of half hour, whatever I've got left. So I'm just going to concentrate on a few kind of key threads that there have been over the past year. So platforms, corporate initiatives, greater dialogue, high-level support, legislation, and the games themselves. Excuse me. So, platforms. There's tons of different gaming platforms. I'm just going to concentrate on two, and for very different reasons as well. The first one being, on the left, the Xbox. So Xbox are now a couple of years into their kind of accessibility journey. The first accessibility features in the console arrived a couple of years ago, and they haven't slowed down at all. So even in the past year, they've had upgrades to Narrator, adding in a new browsing mode. They've upgraded their zoom functionality, so you can now set a zoom level, lock it in place, and play the game while zoomed in. They've added in a mono toggle, so if you have unilateral hearing loss, you can have both stereo channels coming out of both sides. And some more interesting and advanced stuff as well, things that you don't really see on other platforms. So one of them being a API that you can use in a game to allow real-time transcription between voice chat and text chat. So regardless of what kind of communications preference you have, it translates it in real time. So like screen reader style text to speech in one direction and Siri style speech to text in the other direction. All done in real time. Another really, really nice thing they had, again, that you don't really see in other industries, is a feature called Copilot. And Copilot allows you to plug in two controllers into the same console and have them both do exactly the same thing as each other. Which that opens up all kinds of interesting use cases. So, for example, if you've got a kid who's sat there playing, getting frustrated, their parent can kindly sneak on the other controller and help them out a bit. Another nice example, a blind gamer I was speaking to recently who is using it, who basically he can get enough information from the audio to be able to handle kind of shooting and stuff, but doesn't have enough information from the audio to navigate complex environments. So he'll have a friend sat next to him who does the walking around while he does the shooting on the other controller. Something else you can do with it, have the two controllers controlled by a single person. So you could, for example, have the left-hand side of one controller controlled with your hands, the right-hand side of a second controller controlled by your foot, so if you've only got one hand. So loads of really nice stuff. The other one, Nintendo Switch, I'm bringing up for a very different reason. They've just started implementing accessibility features. Just a couple of basic ones to start with. They've got like a grayscale and invert colors. But this is really, really important for this reason, because this marks the first point that all the major gaming platforms, and by that I mean Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo Switch, iOS, Android, Windows, every single one of them now has accessibility options specifically for people with disabilities. And I normally shy away from making claims about things being a first because that's usually a guarantee that it's not. But this one I am absolutely certain about. This is the first time in the entire history of the games industry that this has ever happened. So that's a really, really big landmark. So also last year, to try and help this happen across the other platforms, was some platform accessibility guidelines. So a whole bunch of ideas on features like the kind of stuff that Xbox and Switch are doing to try and raise level of accessibility both at a hardware and operating system level. So that's now freely available for platform holders to look at and hopefully use. Also in guidelines, the game accessibility guidelines that I mentioned earlier on, they hit their 5th birthday. So as part of that, they had quite a major content update, an addition of extra tools for developers to use as well. Like this, like just a downloadable Excel version for use in QA and that kind of stuff. Next thread, initiatives. So this is some really quite major players throughout the games industry starting to get involved with ways to try and help raise awareness and further accessibility in the industry. This one is a picture from Global Game Jam. If you haven't heard the term Game Jam before, it's basically the games industry's terminology for hackathon. And Global Game Jam is something that happens all over the world with tens of thousands of participants every January. And the ESA, Entertainment Software Association, who are basically the USA's games industry body, they sponsored an extra challenge for this Global Game Jam last January, specifically for accessibility. So as well as the people that take part, like I said, the tens of thousands of people that take part, that even if they didn't take up that extra challenge, or at least have read about it, that's a huge, huge piece of awareness raising. PlayStation at PSX, which is their annual consumer event, they held a reception for gamers with disabilities. Microsoft held an accessibility bootcamp, which is basically a one-day internal game accessibility conference for developers. This is a charity called Warfighter Engaged, up on stage there. They adapt hardware for people with various different motor impairments. PlayStation did something very similar for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. This is Shuhei Yoshida, who's the president of Sony Worldwide Studios, with Josh Straub, who's a game accessibility advocate. Same kind of thing, day of talks with advocates, that kind of stuff. And Global Accessibility Awareness Day in general was huge this year for gaming. So as well as PlayStation, Gaikai, Funker, BBC, all running specific game accessibility events. There was tons of other individual advocates and smaller organisations doing other events, writing blog posts, tweeting. It was really, really nice to see. So these initiatives are all kind of temporary one-off things. There's also a couple of nice permanent things happening as well. And this is one of them. This is the Microsoft Inclusive Design Lab. So this is a room that they've set up, the Xbox have set up specifically for accessibility. The people here are looking at some low vision simulations, but there's also tons of assistive tech in there. So basically it's a place, they describe it as like an on-site embassy for advocacy organisations. So it's a place where people from within Microsoft and outside Microsoft can come along and have a play with assistive technology, get a bit more of an understanding and empathy for accessibility issues. And this is another nice, hopefully permanent one. This is Karen Stevens. She was doing a ton of nice accessibility work at EA Sports, which I'll give you an example of later on. EA liked what she was doing and made her accessibility lead for EA Sports. If you're working accessibility in the room here, like the idea of an accessibility lead is a pretty standard thing, but for the games industry it's not. This is, as far as I'm aware at least, the first time that there has been a permanent in-house accessibility role at a big game studio. There's people working full-time in like charities and also like on the hardware side of Xbox, but someone actually within the game studio, this is really big. And I'd expect that this is something that's going to snowball pretty quickly, because there are a lot of other companies now where the level of accessibility work they're doing is growing now to the point where it really is too much for other people to be able to, for the people to be able to do alongside their other duties. So I think over the coming years this is going to happen more and more. And I would assume within a couple of years to the point where there's too much demand for the people with the expertise within the industry to be able to meet. So I can't make any promises, but I would expect there to be opportunities and needs for people to move across from other industries into the games industry to work specifically on accessibility. So all these kind of initiatives, the reason why they're all possible is because of growing top-down support within the games industry. And that's something that's being voiced publicly. Come on, you can do it. There we go. I'm going to read out these quotes in case anyone has got any difficulty seeing them. But this first one, on the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Xbox celebrates all gamers. Really proud of the team's commitment to make fun gaming experiences for everyone. And that's Mike Ibarra, Corporate VP of Gaming for Microsoft. Just spent some time with Sightless Combat again. His love of gaming and work to make gaming accessible to everyone is inspiring. Phil Spencer, head of Xbox. It was very inspirational to hear Josh talk about accessibility in games, what impact we developers can have on the lives of many people. That's Shuhei Yoshida, president of Sony Worldwide Studios. And these kind of comments, they're becoming more and more common. Even 2 years ago, the idea of people at this kind of level in the games industry, giving this kind of vocal support and commitment to accessibility, talking about the time they're spending with the audience, would just have been unimaginable. And it is so important. If you're going to engender lasting cultural change in any industry, you need to have that. You need to have the bottom-up pressure from developers who know what to do, and developers and designers who know what to do and want to do it. You need the top-down support for managers who care and are willing to empower their staff to make those changes. You also need external pressure from the public, saying that's what they want to see. We're getting to the point now where those kind of three things are nicely slotting into place. One last quote for you. Today, all Kim Kardashian game UK revenue will go towards helping disabled gamers, by Kim Kardashian. So this was a fundraising initiative for a charity in the UK called Special Effect, who adapt game controllers for people with disabilities. So this is obviously a nice thing itself, because the Kim Kardashian game makes a ton of money, so that will have helped them out a lot. But the really important thing here is just this mention here of disabled gamers, and the fact that it is Kim Kardashian. Because Kim Kardashian is one of the top 10 most followed people on Twitter. So the people in the room who work on advocacy will really appreciate the power of this. Now, if you could get your message in front of 60 million people, that's how many followers that Kim Kardashian has got. That's how many people she just even mentioned the word of disabled gamers to. And that kind of, the big kind of mass market awareness raising has been happening in the media as well. This was a piece written in The Economist about the business case for accessibility in games. Well, on BBC World News, this was about blind accessibility. Another quote there from Phil Spencer, head of Xbox. We want to make sure that games and consoles that we build are accessible to any kind of player. And I really, really can't understate the importance and value of this kind of like big mass market, broad awareness raising. Because it's exactly this kind of thing that drives not just awareness, but acceptance of both accessibility and people with disabilities in general. It's really, really important. So next up, a change of pace completely, legislation. So these are a couple of things that happened right towards the end of 2017. This photo here is Obama signing into effect a law called the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. Snappy name. So this was him signing. Well, you can see from the fact this Obama signing in, this happened a little while ago. This was in 2010 it was signed in. And basically it's a law that requires communications technology and broadcast video technology to be accessible. And the communications side of it applies to games. So in-game communication functionality, things like text chat and voice chat within a game. So the games industry in general has had a number of waivers, basically because the primary purpose of games isn't communication, it's just kind of a bit of it. Some of the sectors of the industry, like the consoles and distribution and gameplay networks, things like Steam and Xbox Live, their waivers ran out a couple of years ago. Games software is the last one that's left, and that is now due to expire on the 1st of January. So any game that's launching after the 1st of January must have accessible communications. And this is quite a step change for the games industry, because up till this point, the only legislation really that games have been covered by is Section 508, which basically requires WCAG-style accessibility in any software that's used in a federal context. So like games that are used in schools, for example. This applies to all games across the board. If you've got a game that's got communication in it, you need to make sure that communication is accessible. Not just the communication itself, but also the route to navigating towards and like finding that. So that basically requires things like blind accessible interfaces, which is going to be a big change for games. And a welcome one. But another one that's kind of less well known in the games industry at the moment, at least, is the European Accessibility Act. So I've seen there's a few people in the room here at least who are familiar with that. But basically this is aimed at standardising accessibility legislation across all of the EU. And there's two areas that relate to gaming. Firstly, there's communication. They basically kind of copy and paste the communication stuff from CVAA. There's also e-commerce as well. So games have e-commerce in them. So like, for example, buying extra lives in Candy Crush, buying yourself a new gun in Call of Duty, that kind of stuff is done with real money. So all that kind of stuff is going to be covered by accessibility requirements as well. This legislation is in the early days. One branch of the European government, I think it's the Council, have agreed a general approach. So basically kind of what the criteria are going to be, that kind of stuff. The next step is for the other two branches of the government, the Commission and the Parliament, to turn it into a law, which is going to happen gradually over the course of this year. And after that, there'll be another lengthy waiver period of 5 years or so before it comes into effect. So this isn't actually going to hit games for a while yet, but it's nice to be able to have that kind of advanced warning of what's going to be in it. So all the stuff I've been talking about so far, like the platforms, the corporate initiatives, the legislation, the high-level support, this is all kind of stuff that sits around games, but there's been nice progress within games themselves as well. So there's been a whole bunch of big-name games that have been going back in and patching accessibility functionality into their existing products, like Overwatch, a huge game, which is now starting to make strides towards deaf accessibility. Come on, that way. Madden 18. So this is what the Karen Stevens I was talking about earlier has done. The gameplay, not quite the interface yet, but the gameplay itself is now fully accessible to people who are blind. That's a big step. Madden 18 is a hugely popular game. And Karen, who did the work, she actually has hearing loss herself, so that kind of informed the approach she took with it, because normally you think blind accessibility, audio cues, she can't really test audio cues, so she went for haptics instead. So basically a lot of the gameplay is already blind accessible anyway, because you have the commentators describing what's happening in the game. She added in haptics, so for example, when you've got the kick meter going up and down the screen, that equates to a level of vibration in the controller. Vaporum, this is a really nice approach. It's basically whenever you stop moving, everything else in the game stops moving as well. So this is like an option that you can turn on. And that means that regardless of whether it's for motor or cognitive reasons, if you need a bit more time just to pause and think or to coordinate your movements, you can do that anytime you want. It's basically like a pumped up version of bullet time in the Matrix. Mario Kart. So when Mario Kart 8 was ported across to the Nintendo Switch, they added in a couple of extra assists to help automate some of the acceleration and also partially automate some of the steering as well. So you can see here an example of this girl who was able to play from it. Another nice example I saw was somebody who was legally blind, who hadn't been able to play Mario Kart before, but just that little bit of extra assistance was just enough to allow him in while still retaining the challenge. Code 7, another game that had blind accessibility patched in. This is more like traditional web accessibility kind of stuff. So this was a text-based game. So this was more like screen reader support, that kind of stuff that you normally think about. And this is all people going back in retrofitting accessibility after the fact. There's been a growing number of games which are actually thinking about it early in the design process. So you've got all this nice accessibility stuff baked in at launch. One of them being Near Automata. So this has functionality in it that allows you to automate certain areas of the gameplay. So if there's anything you're finding just that a bit too challenging, you can hand control of that over to the machine and have the rest of the gameplay still controlled by yourself. This is a game called She Remembered Caterpillars. This game is a colour-based puzzle game, but it's about mixing colours. So you can see here, you have your reds, your blues, and also your purple, which is obviously a mix of red and blue. This is the kind of thing that a couple of years ago would have been written off as you like. This game is inherently about colour and mixing colour. There's no way you can make that colourblind accessible. But you can see they have. So they basically translated the additive colour system into an additive symbol system. So red is square, blue is circle, purple, which is a mix of red and blue, is a mix of a square and a circle. So you can see they've actually translated this into the aesthetic of the game. The segments of the caterpillars actually reflect those shapes as well. I think see this is really nicely integrated into the gameplay. If they hadn't thought about colour blindness until the end of development, there's no way they'd have been able to do such a nice, well-integrated job as this. It's a really good example of the benefits of thinking about accessibility early in the process. The other thing that thinking about accessibility early allows you to do is to do a lot more. So this is Forza 7. They implemented a whole range of different accessibility features, covering all kinds of different impairments. Again, because they were thinking about that early in the process. Forza 7, that's like a really big name console game. They got hundreds of people working on that game and tons of money. But you don't need that to be able to do a load of good stuff. This is from a game called Mid-Boss. And so you can see it's got a ton of nice stuff in there. Wide range of different difficulty modes, custom mode that allows you to tweak all the variables to your liking, choice of different input devices, configurable controls. Other stuff that's not mentioned here as well, considering colour blindness and simulation sickness too. This game was made by a single person, and they still managed to do all this kind of stuff simply because they thought about it early in the design process. The specific feature that there's been progress on is subtitling. Subtitling in games is horrendous across the board. Like so much like tiny white text on the white background. It's way behind other industries. So it's really nice to see the games industry starting to make strides towards catching up. So you can see here, this is from Hitman. Just that basic thing of allowing to adjust the subtitle size makes a huge difference. Assassin's Creed got in on it as well. So Assassin's Creed, they used the good size by default. You can see what they're doing here is giving you options to turn the speaker name on and off, and also a background behind the text. So this seems like some kind of basic fundamental stuff, but actually the number of games that I'm aware of that have ever given you the option to turn that background on and off is Assassin's Creed and Life is Strange, 2 games. So this is actually a really big deal for the games industry. And something else that makes this really notable is that big game companies, they find it really, really difficult to get approval to share any usage data with the public. Assassin's Creed did it. So they tracked how many people turned on subtitles across all platforms and shared the data, and it came out at 61% across all platforms. For PC in particular, it was higher. PC, it was over 70%. So hopefully that will encourage other people in the industry to take on some of these challenges and get subtitles up to scratch. Because if you've got a feature like that is used by an overwhelming majority of your players, it really, really deserves some good design time. So I'm going to finish up now, and I'm going to talk about something slightly outside the games. I'm going to talk about Star Wars. So, why am I talking about Star Wars? I'm talking about Star Wars because I had a look at the entertainment sales figures for the UK over the past year, and Rogue One sold 1.38 million copies. So that's both digital and boxed, so like all Amazon and Netflix and stuff as well. It actually wasn't the highest selling film of the year. The highest selling film of the year was Beauty and the Beast, which just pipped it with 1.4 million. But why am I showing you Star Wars? I'm showing you Star Wars for a comparison against Call of Duty, 2.44. FIFA, 2.69. So games are literally bigger than Star Wars. And this was the same last year as well. FIFA by far outsold Force Awakens as well. And the reason I'm showing you this is kind of the thought I want to leave you with is at the beginning I talked quite a bit about like the business case and the human case for accessibility. I want to talk to you about the cultural case because Star Wars is obviously a huge, huge cultural phenomenon. It'd be quite a big deal to be excluded from it. The same applies to games. Now, when there's a launch of a big game, whether it's Call of Duty, whether it's Pokemon Go, Candy Crush, take your pick. Like the media is saturated by it. The TV adverts, the news stories, the editorials, all your friends talking about it, all your friends doing it. So because it's such a deeply entrenched part of our society and culture now, that makes it a really, really big deal to be excluded from. But hopefully, as you can see from the kind of things I've been talking about, that exclusion is now really, really starting to reduce. In ever greater numbers, developers have got a much greater level of awareness and level of implementation than ever before. So hopefully, the future is looking very bright. Thank you. I think it's time for questions.
Yes, we have 10 minutes for questions, which is awesome. We've got 2 people with microphones. If you've got a question, put your hand up and I will set the microphones on you.
Cool. First though, just quickly, I have to rush to catch the train like at 9:45, so I'm not going to be around for the social afterwards. But grab me in the break. Also hit me up here at Ian Hamilton _i@shotmail.com. I'll happily talk your ear off. And this URL here, I gave you those 3-4 quotes earlier. There's tons of other ones in there. Loads of really nice inspirational stuff.
Who's got a question?
Any takers?
Hi, thank you for the talk. You started with Candy Crush as an example, and how it was not particularly good, to be honest. Phones and mobile devices, the settings and the accessibility settings in them are so much more advanced than modern computers nowadays. How do you find, and what's your experience of the games that are being produced sort of comparatively? A lot of the examples you gave of positives were from big platforms. What's it like on mobile devices?
What's it like on mobile devices? That's an interesting question. In some areas, it's good. There's mobile developers are generally quite aware of hearing accessibility in particular. It comes from that 60% thing with Assassin's Creed. Obviously, 60% of Assassin's Creed players aren't deaf. There's all these other kinds of use cases why people play with subtitles turned on, some of them specific to games. And mobile developers are generally pretty aware that they have to design for games to be played, for example, playing it on the underground when you haven't got headphones in, that kind of thing. So some stuff like that is really good. There's other things which are not so good, in particular being that the coding frameworks that people use to build games with, so engines like Unreal and Unity, aren't compatible with any of the system level stuff. So like stuff like the out-of-the-box switch scanning and the screen readers as well, both talkback and voiceover, they're reliant on being able to parse the interface elements and speak them out. Games don't render out interface elements. They take all their interface elements and wrap them in just basically like a big lump of pixels. That's all that the screen readers see. So that kind of side of it has been really frustrating, because it's not like if you're developing a native iOS app, then a decent chunk of it is just accessible by default, just from labeling things correctly. It doesn't happen in games. There has been a bit of a move to fix that in the past year. An individual developer actually took on a quite incredible amount of work. I mean, it's frustrating that she'd ever have to do the work, but basically what she's done is replicated the entire of VoiceOver and the entire of TalkBack inside Unity, like just rewritten the entire thing from scratch just herself. So there is now that way in. It's still in like a halfway house, because you have to be aware that this plugin exists and buy it and install it. So you don't get any of the kind of accidental accessibility stuff that you do on other platforms, but hopefully that'll improve. Certainly CVAA with its requirements of line accessible interfaces can't hurt.
Thanks very much for the talk. It was really inspiring. I really liked what you were saying about how designers should try and design for accessibility as early on in the process as possible. And I'm just interested to know what your thoughts are on how to do that in regards to the different types of accessibility that might be needed. So visually impaired, kind of deaf, physical impairment, whatever it might be. How do you make sure that you kind of cover all bases?
Well, I guess the important place to start thinking about it is just when you're having your first ideas, before even like a single line of code or a single design has been done, just when you're having those initial thoughts about what your mechanic is being, because you can kind of bake stuff in just as design decisions without having to spend any resources at all. Even when it comes to figuring out like initial style guides and that kind of stuff, if you take stuff into account, then like a classic being text size. Text size is one of the most commonly complained about accessibility issues in games. There was a game called The Witcher 3, which actually went in and retrofitted a different text size. That would have cost them a ton of time and money, especially with the way games are developed on like fixed screen sizes, like containers that are a certain size and you can't physically increase them. It's not like a website where you can scroll or anything. So they were really, really restricted in what they could do. So they had spent a ton of time, a ton of money to develop something that really wasn't that great anyway. If at the start of development they just decided we're not going to go beneath 28 pixels at 1080p, that's free. It literally costs nothing, it's a design decision. So hopefully in the next game they make, they'll be in that position. And I think there's a lot of games that are kind of at that kind of level now, where they've just kind of started, even like the big stuff that you hear about, like Assassin's Creed, like the motor accessibility stuff done in Uncharted 4. These are all relatively small things done in a couple of weeks towards the end of development. But when they go to make their next game, they're thinking now, like, oh damn it, if I only had some more time, the stuff I could have done, they're going to make another game. That kind of stuff is going to happen much earlier in the process. So it's going to be interesting to see what the next generation of games is going to be like.
So is that question also partly around how do people know what to consider? Because if there is such a range of needs and lots of people aren't familiar with what those needs are, how do people know what to do?
Yeah, well, there's the guidelines that I mentioned. That's a good starting point. But also something else nice that's been happening is that in this kind of like first 1 or 2 generations of studios considering it, is actually getting some of that accessibility included in user research, and that's building up both in-house expertise and the kind of things to consider, and also building up relationships with those people as well. And that's actually something interesting about CVAA. CVAA actually includes a legal requirement to document the stages at which people with disabilities are included in the design process, and a legal requirement to consider it early in the process. So basically the reason for those legal requirements is so when somebody makes a complaint against you, you've then got like the defense of here's the stuff we considered. But yeah, so that's interesting. I haven't come across that before in any kind of accessibility legislation, that user researchers actually have a legal mandate to be responsible for accessibility of the product at early stages. So that's a very interesting development.
So I was quite interested just at the start where you're talking about how games by design are almost inaccessible, and when you look at like kind of inclusive design in other sectors where you might start from an extreme point or an extreme user to kind of be inspired to help the wider audience. Have you seen any examples of that within game design? And if not, do you think it's a viable option, considering if you start with something that may be accessible for someone with quite an extreme situation, whether it might be viable for a wider audience and, you know, be challenging enough, I guess?
Yeah, that absolutely applies. Well, again, that Assassin's Creed subtitling data is a perfect example of that. Like the design considerations they're putting in were specifically for people who are deaf. 60% of their players used them. Another example, Uncharted 4 that I just mentioned, they were putting in design considerations specifically for motor accessibility for people who've got one hand, so you can turn on assists and move the controls around, so you can basically play the game one-handed. That'll like do the camera controls for you, all that kind of stuff. And there's like just under 1% of the population who've only got one hand. The other big studio has shared their usage data. Those features are used by 1/3 of their players. So obviously there's tons of other use cases for this kind of stuff. Even just differences in preference between like an individual person at different times. There's someone who, I think it was someone who worked for PlayStation, talking about their experiences when basically they would, like, if they were playing the game on the weekend, when they've got like a few hours just to sit down and like really like thrash about with a challenge, they would play with none of the assists turned on. If it was in a weeknight, when they had like a half an hour before dinner that they just wanted to relax and unwind, they turn all the assists on and just have like a relaxing kind of experience. So I think there's that interesting side of it. There's about preferences, because you hear a lot about like the kind of permanent physical impairments and how that is also useful for temporary impairments and situational impairments. So temporary, like having a broken arm, situational, like holding a beer. But that preference thing as well, I think, is another way that the value of this kind of work is multiplied.
Last question. Over to Tim.
Hey there. I was just wondering if anything is happening on the hardware side of things. Are people making specialized controllers or anything like that?
Yes, they are. What I'd love to see is a bit more openness from those platforms to allow people to do things more easily. But even within those constraints, yeah, there's tons of stuff. There was a really nice modification that I saw for the Nintendo Switch. So the Nintendo Switch has got like small controllers like this that you have one in each hand. Someone just made like a little L-shaped, like 3D printed block that you stick the two controllers, and they come together in an L shape that you can control them both with one hand with. There's loads of really, really nice adaptations like that. To the charities that I was talking about up on the screen there, Warfighter Engaged and Special Effect, they do like individual customizations of controllers to suit individual people. And there's general multi-purpose assistive tech, so things like quad stick and accessibility switches and stuff that work either kind of just like general purpose way, or can be adapted as part of custom controllers, like rigging up switches to replace some of the controls in the controller, that kind of stuff. So yeah, definitely there's lots of people doing cool stuff.